It's been really great to come out to Yestermorrow. In many ways, they're a sister school to some of the things that we're doing in our mindset and philosophy at Willowbank. So it's been great to kind of swap notes on being small but mighty nonprofits with huge ideas about what we can be doing in the world. I think tonight my talk is going to be broken down into 3 parts. The first part, I'll talk a bit about Willowbank, what we do there, our philosophical approach. And then I am a historian by training, so I can't help it. I have to sneak in a bit of a history lesson, talking about heritage and conservation and how we're kind of getting to this place of an ecological approach to historic preservation, which is where the field really is moving towards these days. And then I'm going to finish off talking about some of the projects that we've been up to that reflect this thinking that we're figuring out at Willowbank right now. So again, I am from Canada, so I'm going to have to do some translating. In Canada, heritage conservation is what Americans call historic preservation. So I'm going to end up using the two kind of interchangeably, which is where that comes from. And otherwise, I'm going to talk at you for a bit, and then I'm happy to take questions at the end. So, talking about Willowbank, first off, hands up, who here has been to Willowbank before? Okay, good. Has anybody heard of Willowbank? Excellent. So just to give a bit of context, we're located in Niagara, Ontario, Canada, just across the border there between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Our campus is in the small village of Queenston, which includes a historic estate, our barns and workshop areas, as well as a former elementary school that we've adaptively reused as part of the program, and about 5 hectares of nature as well. That's just to, maps are nice, but I find pictures are a lot nicer too. Like Yestermorrow, we have a really beautiful setting for our school, again, right on the banks of the Niagara River. Just to the south of us, about a 15-minute drive is Niagara Falls, to give you a sense of the area. And Niagara is probably best known for its wine production, now specializing in ice wines, but it's been an agricultural landscape for centuries. So, Willowbank, we're not one thing, we're several things. We're both a school for restoration arts. We run an accredited 3-year program that offers a diploma in heritage conservation. We're also a historic site, and that is being actively conserved and interpreted to the public. And we are also a Center for Cultural Landscape Research, where we're developing and expressing this idea of an ecological approach to preservation, which I'll be getting into a bit later. So, we work with a number of partners from a local level to an international level. I can't possibly list them all here. You wouldn't want to hear about it. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of our special partnerships. We've received royal patronage. This is a big thing to Canadians, maybe less so for Americans. But we've received royal patronage through the Prince's Trust of Canada. So Prince Charles is our patron. And what this means is that we've also become part of the INTBOW network as well. And hands up, who here has heard of INTBOW before? Great. So INTBOW is the International Network for Traditional Building, Architecture, and Urbanism. And in 2016, we became host to the national chapter in Canada for INTBOW. And it's a global network with a very simple mission of creating better places to live through traditional building, architecture, and urbanism. Right now, there are about 6,000 members in over 100 countries, and we're really about fostering an appreciation and awareness for local and traditional building methods, local character, and that could be everything from a Vermont log cabin to earthen architecture in Mali. So that gets done through outreach, public awareness, workshops, training, education, all that good stuff. So, as for Willowbank, the INTBOW partnership really fits in well with the philosophy that guides everything we do at the school. And that is that we believe places are richer for their diversity, and we embrace this complexity. We like messiness, we like complexity, diversity, different opinions. Angela Garvey was one of our graduates, and I think she put it really well in terms of understanding our approach to heritage and preservation, that we learn to appreciate buildings, neighborhoods, and landscapes, and everything that holds them together, from mortar to memory, and how time affects each. So, talking a bit about Willowbank as a historic site, this philosophy is integrated into our operation of the site. It's an 1834 Greek Revival mansion that was designated as a National Historic Site. It's set within a picturesque landscape, and it's reflective of a very popular building style in Upper Canada at the time, this sort of temple in the wilderness approach to architecture. Over the years, the site has seen many uses. It was built originally as a private residence for the Hamilton family, for whom the city of Hamilton is named after. In the 1930s, it was bought by the Bright family, who were well-known local grape and fruit growers, winemakers in the area. It's been used, had many different institutional uses over the years. It was a boys' school very briefly, a nunnery. You'll see pictures of a wonderful hill that we still sled down. A lot of locals remember that as Nuns Hill. And in the 1980s, it was purchased by a developer who was looking at different ideas for the place. And eventually it was unfortunately threatened with demolition. And our local community came together to say, we're not going to do that, purchase the property. And that's where this idea for the School of Restoration Arts came into place, where the building could be conserved and students could be trained in conservation as they were conserving the building. So the building, the estate itself, is both a setting for our classrooms, but they also form the classrooms themselves. It's a bit of a living laboratory. In 2012, as I mentioned, we took over a former elementary school in the village that had closed down, the Laura Secord School, and we're essentially adaptively reusing a school as a school, which is a lot of fun. And it's allowed us to expand our classroom and office space. And when we took over the building, there were still a lot of layers still intact. All the cubby holes still had the students' names on them. One of the cloakrooms in the building had the students' heights and their names on it. I was just up there last week and noticed that some of our own students have been putting their own heights on there as well. And actually, just to give you a sense of, the way things are, one of our current students went to that school as a child as well. So he's continuing to go to school in that space. Again, we're also a Center for Cultural Landscape Research as well. And the center is really the heart of our research center for exchange and dialogue and outreach on the theory and practice of cultural landscapes. And believe me, we're going to get into cultural landscapes tonight. A lot of the events that are run through our center include public lectures, workshops, short courses, as well as we develop the theory around cultural landscapes. We've also undertaken a number of studies as well through the center. A couple of years ago, we partnered with UNESCO to explore the role that culture might play in meeting sustainable development goals. And we've also done research on particular sites, the sort of sticky, messy, complex places where the traditional approaches of conservation may not be the most appropriate way of conserving the spirit of the place. So This is Kensington Market in Toronto. Hands up how many people have heard or visited Kensington Market before. Best tacos in Toronto, hands down. It's kind of this amazing urban environment that, again, is really messy and chaotic. It's where a lot of the punks like to hang out. And our students a few years ago undertook a conservation management plan of this place. It's also recognized as a National Historic Site for its unconventional nature. This is a planner's nightmare. Everything in this street has kind of been built out organically over the years. Everything is a non-conforming use. But it has this amazing vitality to the place. People and cars and bicycles and shops spill out onto the street, and it all kind of just seems to work in some way. And so if we were to take a traditional conservation approach to managing anarchy, which is a paradox in itself, traditionally we would designate it, we would manage it, we would put in codes and really manage the use and development of the buildings. And actually the recommendation that the students brought forward was don't touch it. Leave it alone. Just let it continue doing its thing. Adopt a very minimal intervention approach to this space. And believe it or not, the urban planners are listening. So we like to think outside of the box and find ways to sustain the spirit of places. So talking about the school now, the center provides a theoretical framework for our school program. And our students come from across Canada. We've had some from the US, also internationally as well. It is a small program. We cap participation at 12 students because the students move through that experience together, and that's part of what makes the program so special. Our students come from a variety of different backgrounds. In our first years this year, we have a student coming from a museum studies background. We have a fine furniture maker. We have a student with a planning background, another student with an architecture and design background. And again, one of the things that the students take out from the program is learning to appreciate those different perspectives and also that out-of-the-box thinking as well. So our curriculum is broken down into 3 main areas: research documentation, planning and project management, and then craft and design skills. In the first year, our students really focus on their craft skills and individual work, as well as some of the foundational skills of historical research, architectural theory, and history. In year 2, they continue developing those craft skills and then also take on more design and planning projects in a teamwork-based environment. And then in the 3rd year, we're training our little birdies to leave the nest. So we give them courses in professional development, project management, and then they also undertake a 5-month internship or personal research project that's really geared around their own personal interests in conservation, whatever that is. So we've had students go out to Nova Scotia and undertake documentaries on timber framing traditions out there. We had a student intern with UNESCO in Paris. Others have interned with design and planning firms. And then others, I was saying to Sophie, one of our students is really into tiny houses and is looking at how you design and build a tiny house using traditional building techniques and recycled historic materials as well, and integrating that in a sensitive way. So I never know what the students are going to do, but it's always very interesting and exciting. Basically, through the whole program, when our students graduate out, they're being given a diverse set of skills, but also a certain perspective and a set of values rooted in stewardship and an appreciation for place and many different peoples, which we feel are the skills that are needed for the 21st century preservationist, as well as a professional network, which always helps. Yeah. So I just want to take a little bit of time to quickly highlight some of the courses that the students undertake. We give them training in a variety of different tools that they use to come to understand place. So that includes architectural records, community engagement practices, cultural mapping, as well as historical research. And they then apply this understanding of place from different perspectives to design, planning, and management challenges, usually through that conservation management plan that I was talking about earlier. And in the program, we really place an emphasis on learning by doing, much like what happens at Yestermorrow. And we especially focus on craft skills. We encourage our students to understand and use traditional methods. That means hand tools. And it's all about a way of allowing the students to connect their head and their hands and their heart in a really holistic way, which really is kind of at the center of a more sustainable way of looking at the world. The students do get experience with several different building materials, so wood, stone, plasterwork, glass, metal as well. And not only do they gain an appreciation for those materials, but also the traditional knowledge that goes into understanding how they work and what to do with them. And many of these traditional craft skills are actually at risk of disappearing these days, given some of the changes that are happening in society and with changing building methods as well. So I look at this picture and I see our students doing some blacksmithing with our instructor, Lloyd, and it's wonderful if the only lesson they get out of blacksmithing is that they likely will not be a blacksmithing, that's fine. However, if one of them feels inspired to pick up that craft, then we've kind of done our due diligence. I look at somebody like Lloyd, our program is 3 years, but really we're taking a lifetime of learning and trying to condense it into those 3 years. And you look at somebody like Lloyd and he has, a lifetime of experience under his belt, but that traditional knowledge that he has, actually, he has hundreds of years of knowledge in his brain that he is imparting to the students. And we like to think we're helping to continue those traditions. So all of this, again, tying all of these different courses together is this ecological approach. It's this deep understanding of the relationship between people and place, how that evolves over time. And in this way, heritage is really understood as something more than buildings. And I hope that's a takeaway tonight, that heritage is more than buildings. So that leads us to the question. We're now entering into the historical lecture part of the evening. So sit back and relax. This is my favorite question. What is heritage? I want to talk a little bit about this term right now. Oftentimes we use it in historic preservation like we're all talking about the same thing, but we actually hold many different ideas about what heritage is. Maybe one of the most popular when you use the word heritage, thinking about buildings and monuments, could be anything from the streetscape in Hamilton to Angkor Wat in Cambodia. But heritage can also be movable cultural heritage and artifacts, so archival material, or even First Nation dolls, which is a very popular tradition in Alaska, the Yukon, Northwest Territories. Heritage can also be very personal, as well as having national or international significance. So genealogy and personal heritage is another form of heritage. But we're also coming to understand heritage as linear, or kind of these amalgams of natural and cultural elements. So places like the Camino de Santiago in France and Spain, which is actually a pilgrimage route. So the importance of this heritage are both the natural features and the trail, but also the sort of act of walking that trail as well, that living tradition associated and really tied in with the landscape. Other trails or waterways could be Much like the Rideau Canal here in Ottawa, this is actually a World Heritage Site that was constructed during the War of 1812, a defensive route in case the Americans ever tried to invade Canada again, so part of military defensive works, and we appreciate it for that, but we also more these days appreciate it for the skating that we can do in the winter and the cultural tourism associated with that. Lots of Americans come up to skate the canal. Heritage can also be intangible cultural heritage. So this is getting away from a material understanding of heritage to a more intangible or immaterial kind of heritage. So songs, stories, traditions, much like Ukrainian dancing on the left, or the Inuit elder with the youth out on the landscape talking about place names, talking about how to harvest from the land as well. And how we conserve intangible cultural heritage or traditions is different from how you conserve a building, but there are some similarities to them as well. But it's all about understanding the types of heritage that you're dealing with and having an appreciation for what tool you might use to manage and conserve that. Which leads us to the second part of the history lesson, talking about conservation. The noted conservationist Julian Smith talks about a series of biases in terms of how we've approached conserving or preserving heritage over the years. And really, conservation is all about decision making. We can't bring forward everything from the past into the future. And so we have to think carefully about what we do select to transmit for future generations. And again, the idea of what we select to transmit to the future, how and why, Julian talks about several different biases that have kind of colored conservation over the years. The first being the antiquarian bias, which emerged in the 1700s in Europe, and really focuses on artifacts from ancient civilizations, and conservation was done primarily by archaeologists who were using this to tell great stories about culture. And this is at the time where antiquities were collected both for achieving a certain type of status in society, but also for study as well. So you have some really interesting conservation methods coming out of this time, like anastylosis, which is basically taking old historic bits of material and embedding them into new buildings, much like this very famous Italian villa whose name completely escapes me right now. Another one of the biases that emerged out of the 1800s was commemorative bias. And this is where the focus is really on monuments and historic places, where historians use that to tell stories of these places through reconstructions. In this sense, heritage was valued for both nation building and public education as well. And so this is where you have projects like the Arc de Triomphe being constructed, as well as the Modern Museum. This is where that emerges. So that's the Louvre on the left there in Paris. And another bias that started emerging in conservation in the 1900s was this aesthetic bias. And you still see this today. It's really informing the field. And that is really where architects and architectural historians start articulating a new value for historic places and looking beyond just isolated monuments and sites and towards districts and neighborhoods. And so that's where you have places like colonial Williamsburg becoming important for a sense of place, their sort of historic character. And the value of that historic character is the fact that it's not modern, that these are sort of disappearing ways that places are constructed. And that also introduces kind of a scientific language for the conservation of historic places. Which leads us to this ecological approach, which began emerging in the 20th century and which we're seeing is increasingly where the field is headed towards. It's about conserving both the integrity of historic materials, but also the authenticity of historic places. So the cultural values that give it value and significance. It's really this holistic view that appreciates the interconnectedness between people and place and how that's given meaning through rituals and repeated actions. And we get called out sometimes in the field for being a little seditious because we see conservation as a dynamic process. You know, the idea of conservation being about freezing a place in time, or conservation being something more subtle about change management and really being this process that seeks to find that balance within diversity. And this is where we're seeing the natural conservation field and the historic preservation field are starting to come together on that to appreciate the natural and cultural elements of place and how they kind of interact. And this is where we're seeing not just the architect, the archaeologist, the architectural historian, but also the cultural geographer and other disciplines, community development, for example, becoming incorporated into conservation and the conservation process through this cultural landscape approach, where we appreciate how places are valued not just for their aesthetic, but also their historical, social, and spiritual significance. And this is one of the temples in Nara, Japan. And this temple is basically deconstructed and completely rebuilt from scratch every 20 years. And that, from a traditional preservationist perspective, is, that's the perfect word for it. But from this cultural landscape perspective, that deconstruction actually and rebuilding is actually part of the authenticity of the place, and it actually keeps the traditions associated with that place alive and prevent it from museumifying is one of the words that I've heard for it. Keeps the skills alive, yeah. Yeah, so that ecological approach, it's about this cultural landscapes approach. And I realize I've thrown that word at you several times already without defining it. So now we're going to define it. And of course, being a historian, you know, let's talk about the history of the term. And I'll share this. In grad school, I took a class on cultural landscapes. I spent an entire semester looking at these two words and their meanings. And at the beginning of the class, our professor asked us, what is a cultural landscape? And we kind of threw around a bunch of ideas. And at the end of the class, he asked us the same question. And we were just as confused and befuddled, but we had more answers as well. And kind of the short answer is that cultural landscapes are both a type of heritage to be conserved, but also a way of seeing as well. And if you can hold those two ideas kind of in your brain together, then that's kind of what we're looking at when we talk about an ecological approach. So this is just a bit about the history of the term. It really emerges out of the European landscape painting tradition, where the term was used to describe both the paintings, but also the landscapes that were depicted in the paintings. We also pick up some understanding of the term from geography and mapping. Carl Sauer was an early 20th century geographer that gave us an understanding of cultural landscapes as having these layers that we can read and observe within the landscape. And it's really about this relationship between people and the environment and kind of the richness that comes from that. Looking at a management perspective, there still are many definitions of cultural landscapes, but the terms used by UNESCO in the World Heritage System, you'll see those reflected in a lot of places. And that's really about properties that, again, represent this combined work of man and nature. And within that, there are several types of cultural landscapes. There are designed cultural landscapes that are designed intentionally by man. So these are the Kew Gardens in England, where actually a lot of our understanding about the natural environment came out of a lot of the research that was done at these gardens. There are also evolved landscapes, which could be both organically evolved or a relict and fossil landscape. So examples of those could be Easter Island, for example, as a relict landscape, or again, Kensington Market as this idea of an active, ongoing landscape. And then we also have associative landscapes, which may be valued for their intangible associations, their cultural significance. And so we have places like Ayers Rock in Australia, which is this really wonderful sandstone natural landmark, probably one of the best known in Australia, but it's also valued by the local indigenous people for spiritual reasons. And the management of this site is a really interesting case study in how you balance those different appreciations of this place, because, and I think most of us come from a Western background here, you see a rock like that, what is the first thing you want to do with it? Climb it. To protect the spiritual significance of this place, First Nations people leave it alone. They don't want you to climb it. And so what do you do when you have tourists coming from around the world who want to see this rock? Well, they've put out 2 different sets of interpretive panels. The one explaining the importance from the Western perspective and giving guidance if you're going to climb it, here's how you climb it safely. And then the other in partnership with the Indigenous group talking about the spiritual significance and encouraging people to not climb on it. And so it's up to the tourists themselves to decide what they're going to do. So those are some of the types of cultural landscapes and ways you might manage them. Now, cultural landscapes. These provide all sorts of new and interesting challenges for us that we're only just starting to uncover as we're having these conversations on site. And we're doing a lot of work these days. It seems everyone's kind of thinking about what the 21st century might hold, and we're doing that in terms of historic preservation. And some of the challenges that we've taken up at Willowbank that we're hoping to address through our program relate both to the conservation of our historic places, but also the role that they might have in addressing some of these bigger challenges that we're dealing with as societies these days. Climate change, maybe being one of them. But some of the challenges we're hoping to take in our teeth, including, again, sustaining these craft skills and knowledge relating to traditional building practices, encouraging a sensitive approach to not just approaching historic places. Often, historic places can't speak for themselves. We really kind of have to listen to what makes them important. But then also appreciating all the different types of expertise that we're going to need to conserve historic places going forward. And that includes the role of people like myself, heritage practitioners, but also the role of communities, who often have an expertise of their own, a cultural expertise associated with a place. And then really, of course, to the big challenge to sustain that balance and diversity of our built and natural environments. So with that, are you guys still with me? Brain dead? Good? Okay, now comes the fun part. Let's talk about some of our projects. So one of the biggest projects that we've had going on site, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a bunch of different projects at you, and if I've done my job right, we're kind of layering an understanding of Willowbank in this room, not even being there, but I hope you can kind of see how they all kind of inform one another. But one of the biggest projects still ongoing is the restoration of an 1830s estate, 3.5-story building, 5 hectares of land. Did I mention we're a not-for-profit with no money? So that's a fun challenge. And one of the first challenges we had with the estate when we took it over was restabilizing the southwest wall on the building. This all sits on a nice big bed of clay, and that wall was actually starting to sink and come apart from the building in kind of an alarming way. So some of the first work that we did was to dig down, completely reset and rebuild the foundation. We did a lot of repointing work on the walls over successive years of students. And we were able to get it reset in place as well. The students were involved in the process. It was really about, again, embodying those kind of living traditions. A lot of the stone was sourced from a local quarry, and the students were involved in the repointing work from selecting the limestone that went into the lime kiln, that became lime putty, that was mixed into the mortar, that was repointed on the building. And you can tell, if you look at the building, there are about 4 different colors of mortar, depending on which year of students mixed it up. And that's how they learned historic repointing methods. That really important foundational and exterior work laid the groundwork for some really important interior work that we did on the building. And last year we just wrapped up, it was about $1.4 million all told in facility upgrades. We introduced an elevator into the building, fire suppression systems, a new kitchen, as well as some restoration work to some of the interior plaster work and the carpentry work in there. We still have a lot of work on the building to go. I'm going to put this pitch out there. If any of you happen to have any old growth tulip wood trees, I would really like to talk to you, because a couple of our columns will be due for replacement in a few years. But for now, all this work allows us to open up the building, not just for the school program, but also for rentals and special events and things like that as well, which nets us a bit of revenue, which allows us to invest that money back into the school programming for the students. The elevator was a really interesting design challenge that, again, our students were involved in. Where you put an elevator in a building like that while respecting the historic character of the building is a really important question that we're asking in a lot of buildings. Some places it's done well, some places it could be done a little more sensitively. In the end, we kind of had this conversation about whether the elevator would go on the outside of the building, or would we compromise some of our interior footprint by putting it in the interior. In the end, we ended up going with the interior and sacrificing some of my office space and the kitchen space because we recognized that it was that the value of that, the aesthetic value of the outside of that building, which had basically been unchanged since construction, was really important. And so that was one of the compromises that we made on the site. Another continuing project on the site is the design build of our Forge studio. These are some of the early blueprints, ideas of this project. And it was all about creating an entirely new building using traditional methods. And it's a design that I believe comes from Northern Europe. And the idea was that we were going to build this. It's a community-based project. Constructed over several years. We brought together master craftsmen, dry stone wallers and timber framers from across Canada, the US, and the UK. There's something, I wasn't there when they got together, but hearing the stories of a bunch of master craftsmen coming together and working to outdo each other on like how good they could construct this was apparently a lot of fun. So it is a dry stone wall and a timber frame structure, and the roof actually sits on the dry stack as well. It is a permitted structure, we kind of had an interesting conversation with our local municipal planners as we sought for approvals for this. And as far as we know, it is the first permitted dry stone timber frame structure in North America, but we would love to be proven wrong as well. So here are some more pictures of the building coming together. A lot of stone, again, a lot of it was sourced locally from a historic quarry that we've also, in effect, helped to restart through some of our projects. Yeah, almost every year of students who have come through our program have worked on this building. And Sophie was giving me a tour of Yestermorrow today and realizing that you guys also have this wonderful kind of outdoor timber frame kind of building, and appreciating, you know, what happens when many years of people come together and kind of form their own place attachment with that place, and how special that is. So we've had timber framing courses on this building. We've had dry stone courses on this building. Most recently, we've had roofing courses on this building, and this was taken about a month ago. And the next steps will be to finish off the slate roof on there in the spring. The snow today reminding us that winter is coming. And I'm sure in about 20 to 25 years, we'll start to have roofing repair courses on the building. But again, the building continues to evolve. It's now home to our blacksmithing, and it's a very primitive structure. Eventually, we hope to close it in and maybe do an adaptive reuse, make it available for how we balance the use of yoga with blacksmithing. I'm not sure, but we'll figure it out. So our approach doesn't just look at conserving historic places, doesn't just look at creating new old buildings, but we also look at the ecological values of this place as well. And as I mentioned, this sort of temple in the woods approach to this historic estate, it's set within a picturesque landscape. And some of the thinking behind a picturesque landscape, it comes out, it's really rooted in a Western Christian understanding of the relationship between man and nature, where nature is this wild, savage, evil place that is meant to be overcome and subdued by man. And the site does have significant natural values. We have a ravine that runs along the north side of the estate that was used as a natural portage route to get around Niagara Falls. We're about the last place on the river where you can get out safely before things get a little gnarly upstream. And the route has been used, we've done archaeological tests on site dating back 8,000 years. So it would have been used as a natural portage route, a place of exchange for Indigenous people as well. And so one of our student-led projects was to look at rewilding our landscape. And we had a few guiding principles to support that work. So the idea of first protecting the heritage, both the cultural and natural heritage, integrating community into that process as well. So we worked with the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, sorry, it's a long day, as well as local Indigenous groups and local residents and students and faculty. We also valued innovation, so new and different ways of thinking, looking at what was emerging out of the sustainability field, natural conservation, and education was also one of our goals. So extending the idea of it being a learning environment and a living laboratory, not just in the historic building itself, but also the natural landscape and what lessons we could learn from that. And then ecology was one of our values. So this idea of rewilding, of reintroducing pollinators, bees, you know, the things that keep those natural processes going and prevent, you know, nature from becoming a museum. So we recognized that there were some Things on site that we did not want to continue to transmit into the future, poison ivy kind of being one of them. And then we recognized there were some things that we, historic elements we wanted to incorporate, so a lot of native species, but then also new elements like our Indigenous community garden that I'll talk about in just a couple of seconds. And then the students got to work. So what I'm really excited about in terms of our lower pasture is that, in effect, we were able to reconnect our site with the natural values of the ravine to the side of it. And this was also done, this is where we get super cultural landscapey, this was also done in a way that not only appreciated the natural values of the site, but also the historic human elements of the site. And so we did that through the simple act of mowing. This is our carriageway. You can see the white gatehouse at the bottom of the hill there. And we just, this was the original historic entrance to the estate, and we basically just mowed the carriage path that the horses would have come up as a way of just kind of subtly reminding ourselves about the picturesque landscape that was there before we rewilded it. So again, part of the rewilding and our natural conservation included our Indigenous community garden, because we recognized that there were Indigenous values, layers of meaning to the site, and we kind of wanted to bring those back to life, but in a meaningful way. And so working with local Indigenous groups, we planted a community garden in the shape of a traditional medicine wheel. The 4 medicines are planted in the center of the garden. The 3 sisters, corn, squash, and beans, we planted those. And that's been a really wonderful partnership we've had that has just kind of been evolving naturally on its own. And it becomes a teaching garden for us to talk about the linkages between sustainability and preservation of cultural traditions, but it's also become a space we've invited Indigenous people on site, and it's become the space for them to use. They bring their youth out and do their own teachings and keep alive their own traditions as well. And sorry, I'm getting goosebumps. And then you can see our blacksmith forge is just in the corner there. They've actually come to start using that place. They call it their longhouse. And so they're also using that space as well in their own way. And so we just, work with them to kind of allow that to happen. And those are some of the, rather than just not talking about Indigenous heritage, or relegating it to just having some archaeological objects on display. We're demonstrating to National Historic Sites across Canada what kind of a relationship you can have with Indigenous people and local communities in a meaningful way. I'm going to throw one more at you before I finish, and this is talking about some of the work that we do off-site, not in Niagara. And this is with our partners Messors, who are conserving the Fernello Caves in Puglia in southern Italy. And this project is deceivingly simple, but there are so many layers of things that are going on there that is really exciting and really embodies this cultural landscape approach to conservation. So the site itself is a set of caves that date back to about 5 BC that have been inhabited on and off since then, and have been perhaps best used or most longest used by local shepherds for aging their cheeses in a cheese-making tradition. They're nice, cool caves for some really delicious, raw, unpasteurized cheese. These local shepherding traditions, once again, are at risk. Like a lot of areas, rural depopulation has been a big issue, but also government regulations around cheese. And cheese production have made it a bit challenging to continue this unpasteurized tradition. But adding to that, the caves have also been used for religious purposes for hundreds of years. And there are these amazing frescoes that date back to the Byzantine era that have been painted on and painted on and painted on. And part of the conservation project is about painstakingly restoring these really amazing frescoes in the cave, but has also included the conservation of the dry stone walls and some of the shepherding buildings just outside of the caves as well. And of course, taking that cultural landscape living tradition approach, part of the field school that we help run there with Messors, you're not just getting your hands dirty and doing some conservation work, which is also community-based and working with the local community. You are also keeping those traditions alive. One of our students went over and took part in the field school this summer, and they basically spent the first couple of days making cheese that every participant ended up eating over the course of the next week, which gave them the fuel to go conserve the caves, which will help to produce more cheese for people to eat. You can kind of see that living tradition kind of happening there. So I think I'm going to leave it there. That just gives you kind of an idea of what we're up to just over in Niagara, a bit of an understanding of this ecological approach to historic preservation, and hopefully inspires you to think about what role our historic places might play in the 21st century. So, thank you.